Hi, welcome to this week's devotions. We're looking at Galatians chapter 5 this week and next. Galatians 5 verse 1 is one of those scriptures that I just know. I don't need to look it up, I just know it. It was for freedom that Christ has set us free. I've read it, I've preached on it, I've quoted it in prayers, I've sung it in songs. There's only one problem. I've got it wrong. I've always thought, I've misremembered it, that it says it was for freedom that Christ has set us free. Now, I know the verse is more than that. I know it goes on to say, therefore do not be yoked again to slavery. But when studying it this last few weeks, I've realised it doesn't say it was for freedom that Christ has set us free. It says it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Now, maybe you don't think that's very significant. Maybe that's just one of those things that preachers say to try and make a point. But I think it is significant. At least it's significant for me. You see, I know that Paul is saying that Christ has set us free in the past. I know that Paul is saying it's all done. I know he's saying it's a done deal. What Christ achieved for us on the cross is a once for all act of grace. That's why Paul uses the aorist tense, because it's in the past and it's complete. We've spent these weeks in Galatians saying again and again, the gospel is not Jesus plus, it's Jesus. It's grace. I know that. I know that is all past tense. And I think because I know that so strongly, I've assumed it says it was for freedom. But that's not what it says. It says it is for freedom. And I've realised what that means is that as well as being set free from my sin by a past event, whether that's the past event of Jesus on the cross or that past event of the 27th of February 1983 when I walked to the front of a church building and gave my life to Jesus. In fact, I was just realising that he'd already given his life for me. As well as that past event that transformed my life, I'm meant to live a transformed life. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. My freedom is not just something that was won, it's something that is. I am free. I can live in the good of that freedom. God really isn't a spoil sport. God really isn't just trying to give me a list of rules to limit my life. No, the grace of God is setting me free for fullness of life. I think that's why Paul, who did remember what he'd written, that's why Paul is so aghast that the Galatians are going back to the slavery of the law. That's why in these passages, in these verses in Galatians chapter 5, Paul is trying to say to them, don't get enslaved. Freedom is so important to Paul. The present freedom of the grace of God is so important to Paul that he's saying, don't get enslaved to the law. But also he says, don't get enslaved to license. Paul doesn't want them trapped by legalism, but he also doesn't want them trapped by license. Let me just quote here. Where legalism locks me into trying to please God through enough religious activity, a life of license, a life of no boundaries, traps me in an endless pursuit of trying to please myself or others. I found that so helpful when I read that. A life of license traps me in an endless pursuit of trying to please myself or others. You see, Paul is clear, the legalist and the anarchist are both enslaved. And he fights for freedom because he knows Christ fought for our freedom. It is for freedom that we have been set free. A life of true freedom for Paul is found when we know the total acceptance of God. To know that we're loved because we're loved, not because we're always lovable. We're not always lovable, but we are loved. In these verses, which I'd encourage you to read over and over again this week, we're reminded if we stand firm on the grace of God, and if we allow ourselves to live lives of humble service, generous lives, and if we keep in step with the Spirit, which we'll look at next week, we will live free lives. We'll live lives of freedom and of joy. I want to encourage us to think about that this week. This tension of legalism and license, which one are you more likely to get caught out by? I know for myself, it can depend a bit who I'm with. If I'm with one crowd, I can maybe be entrapped by license, but with another crowd, it might be legalism. How do I navigate that? How do you navigate that? Spend some time this week just allowing God to speak to you about that tension in your own life. Maybe spend some time this week chatting to friends about it. Maybe in your life groups this week, unpack it together. But also for this week and also in preparation for next, can I encourage you to try and make some space just to sit with God and allow the Holy Spirit to minister to you? As we'll see next week, the key, having stood on the grace of God, having lived generous lives, the key is to keep in step with the Holy Spirit. So in preparation for that, why not try and carve out just a little bit of time just to allow the Holy Spirit to minister to you this week, to remind you you're loved because you're loved, not because you're always lovable. And Christ died that you might have freedom now, in the here and now, in this day, in the midst of all the mundane things of life. Christ died so that you might have freedom, so that I might have freedom, that we might live lives free and full of joy. Bless you.